Yeah, well, so I do think, though, that I was starting to say there are healthy children, huzzah. But there are a lot of kids, even coming from healthy families, where things happen, bad things happen to good people. And often, especially, even my generation, our parents didn't tell us anything. And I think my generation is trying to do a slightly better job, but there's still a lot of teens being raised by people who don't know how to talk about things like human sexuality and violence and bullying and addictions and the stuff that kind of can really ruin your life. So how do I choose these things? They choose me. I mean, I try to be articulate about the writing process, and I'm very happy to discuss it. I imagine there are some writers in the audience. But there is a mystical part of writing that defies all explanation. And it's, to me, I think it's the best part of writing. It's when you've turned off all of your screens, and you're kind of in that place. It's I find it's very similar to where I go when I'm in prayer, or meditation. It's just this silent, kind of filled with glory place. And the ideas and the characters, they just show up, and if you're smart, you're scribbling. And so, the character of Gracie, I knew from the moment that character popped up in my head that it looks like everything's great, but it's really not. And Finn, who's I have the worst crush on in the world, that's Haley's love interest in the book, that he too was coming from a place that had some brokenness in it. There's some great stuff in his family, but he's got some secrets too. And that's very common. There's a great Tumblr that goes around 1 million times a day that talks about this great phrase that be very kind. Let me see if I get the phrase right. Be kind because everyone is fighting a battle in their hearts. And it's so fascinating with teens. I think you often feel so alienated. Everybody does at one time or another. Feel so alone. And when you have the courage to lower your barriers and talk about your truth to somebody, and then they share their truth with you, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, you are my best friend because you don't judge me and you have something too, and now we've just bonded, and that's amazing.
One of the themes in Speak, in terms of the school setting, is you bring up the idea of the drones and the Marthas. Yeah. And then in The Impossible Knife of Memory, you're talking about the zombies versus the freaks. Yeah. So can you talk about just this conformity, the pressure of conformity, and why it's better to be a freak?
Yeah, and I think that this is very common when you're, not even when you're a teenager, but even as an adult. Like, I'm a pretty well-adjusted adult, all things considered. But when I'm in a social situation about which I'm anxious, and I can feel my anxiety level rising, and I tend to look around and I go, oh my God, nobody else is feeling as anxious as I am right now. Everybody else is very happy and their lives are perfect, and they don't have any spinach in their teeth, and they remember to use deodorant this morning, and I'm the only, you go right back to your 15-year-old self. And so I think that a little bit of what you see in both of those books is a confused, sad, angry character who's really pissed off because she doesn't feel she fits in anywhere. But also there's something about particularly American suburban high school culture that really makes me want to get my chainsaw out. Because I think it's damaging. I wish that I could speak to a room this big filled with high school administrators and school board members, because we screw it up every single blessed day. We have such opportunities in this country if we would just start spending some money on our educators and on our schools and on our children, that we have such potential in America. And yet, generation after generation, we continue to shortchange our kids and create these environments where they're not surrounded by love. Where we're trying to turn them into widgets, because Henry Ford screwed us all up with that factory model. And we've turned children into widgets that we plug into 45 or 90-minute slots, and then we expect them to do well on this test. Why do we expect them to do well on this test? Because the colleges won't, it's just, don't get me going here, but it's
I want
crazy.
to get you going on one specific idea that you mentioned. When you're saying, spend more money, retool the system. Okay, if Laurie Halse Anderson was in charge of the school system, where would you spend the money?
Oh, please, God. I think one of the things that I see would be the quickest fix would be to shift instruction so that instead of having, I would group science and math together with English and social studies, those two kinds of subjects, and then have students be with the same teachers all 4 years, right?
Yeah.
Because you develop that relationship with that teacher, you're finally getting to know them. They're finally getting to know you. You're 15 years old and you're like, okay, you know what, this guy's not a total jerk. Maybe he's got a point, I should do my homework. Because it's actually, these Etruscan people, they're kind of interesting, right? So you're finally getting to the point where you're willing to be educated by this person. And this nice person finally understands how to help you with your education. And time to change classes again. Time to change semesters. And so we are denying our students the opportunities to develop relationships with loving, trustworthy adults when they most need them.
Wow. Idea number 2 on your list, and then we'll move on.
Start paying teachers what they're worth.
Yeah. Woo!
How do you stay current? I mean, I'm reading Speak, and I'm feeling like this could have existed back when I was in high school in the 80s. But then when I'm reading The Impossible Knife of Memory, even the drug that's being abused by the sister is prescription pills.
Mm-hmm.
So that's changed. It could have been cocaine 30 years ago. So how do you stay current on what are the real issues? How are things in reality now for teens?
The issues don't change. The issues don't change. The details change. And I'm a historical novelist too, right? So I know a little bit about research. And so it's just for me about getting, and you don't even need a lot of details, but I do feel a responsibility if I'm writing a book that's set in today's time period, at least for those readers who are going to read the book within a couple of years after its publication, just to give them a couple of handles, cultural context handles, so that they'll go, oh, right, this is the world of today. I mean, Speak doesn't have any cell phones in it. Speak has no technology in it at all. I think there might even be a payphone in it. And it's fascinating to me and I thought a long time, I have actually a linguistics degree, and one of the things I thought about when I was working on Speak was use of jargon. Because, every generation, like every 3 years, teenagers reinvent slang for themselves because they want their slang. They don't want their older brother's slang. And I decided to not go there because I know how quickly language changes. And that dates it. So just finding a couple of details, I think, is enough to ground the readers for a few years, and then it won't matter.
The thing about reading your writing is that when you were saying, I write about some really depressing stuff, which you do, but it's hilarious. So
Yeah.
Can you talk about, part of it is the language that you choose to use, which does sound very authentically teen, but part of it is just that you're presenting these really tortured scenarios or like the psyche in a really humorous way. So how do you, is that just you, or is it, how is it?
No, this is the best part. I think if you're a teacher or a librarian in the room, and you've been working with teens for more than 2 years, you like this about teenagers too. Teenagers, it's so awful what we make them do, but they've all gotten to the age where they're opening their eyes and going, you all are the biggest hypocrites in the whole planet, aren't you? I like to borrow this expression, I forget the name of the writer, but this man was writing about J.D. Salinger. He did a biographical piece in Time magazine right after one of Salinger's early books came out, and he described Salinger as a man without eyelids. Now imagine what that would be like if you didn't have eyelids. First of all, you would have to look at everything. You could never rest. And it would always hurt, right? Because there's no way, there's no tears, it's just always this raw. I can see people are blinking all over the audience right now. I think that's what it's like to be a teenager in modern American culture, because everything is coming at you. One of the most lovely coping mechanisms that I see pretty much every teen I've ever met has is a sharply defined sense of humor and sarcasm. And they wield that like a shield and a sword. To skewer the hypocrisies that they're surrounded by, and to try to, sarcasm is a tool of the vulnerable. If you can laugh at something, if you can mock something, usually it's because it's bothering you, and that creates a little bit of distance, and you protect yourself a little bit. So teenagers are the funniest of any age group. And too sadly, because we all know a lot of deeply unfunny adults. And I think those are teenagers who kind of lost track a little bit.
So how at age 52?
52.
52?
And change.
How do you manage to keep your inner teenager alive?
My husband, who's known me for my husband's known me for 49 years, would tell you that I have not matured a day past 15 emotionally. I'm very much the same person. I come from funny people. My parents were, when they weren't drunk or screaming, were pretty funny. And I think, I don't know, I do think that the wounds of those years, I actually am kind of mature. I pay my taxes on time and stuff. But I just have such a clear memory of what it felt like to be those kids. No, that's never going to leave.
That is amazing. I'm going to move on to something more serious in this book, and some of the flashback scenes. And I wanted to ask you to read one of them, and I've flagged page 61.
Oh, super.
So I will let her read that.
By the way, thank you for doing that, because most moderators say, well, would you like to read from your book? And that's when I start breaking out in hives. Because I never know what to read, but you've chosen the passage. So thanks for that.
Yeah, well, it probably won't be there. But
no, it's right here.
All
Actually,
right.
This is a really good one, too. So let me just set up a little bit. There are half dozen or so one-page sections in the book set in a different type that are told in Haley's father's voice. And I'm going to read this first, and then I will tell you why I made that decision. And all of these sections are his memories of the war. This is chapter 20, page 61. I hitch a ride back to the outpost in a truck filled with ammunition, pork chops, and 2 guys from Bravo Company. Private First Class Mariah Stoltzfus drives, telling me about Jaden, her dancing toddler in Arkansas. We follow a Humvee that is filled with boys barely old enough to shave. A star goes supernova in the middle of the road. We fly, wingless birds. Shock waves ripple through metal, glass, and flesh. Bone crumbles, skin explodes, nerves snap, brains slosh and spill in dented tin skulls. Arteries spray like high-pressure hoses, painting the world a bright, sad red. I swim through the smoke. Private Stoltzfus still sits behind the wheel. I wipe the blood off her face to find her mouth, make her breathe. She doesn't have a mouth. She doesn't have a face anymore. Boys pull me away, strong boys with faces and mouths. They help me sit in the dust and try to get Private Stoltzfus out of the truck. Her arm comes off in their hands. Her blood trickles, drips. Her heart exploded in the middle of her story. In Arkansas, her son dances, waiting.
it's chilling. It makes me want to cry. And I just feel like it's so important that you put that in the book, just because the story is not being told. Right. The horror. All we're hearing about is that these guys are coming back and they're shooting up army bases. But we're not hearing about that reality of what's making them do that, right? So where do stories like that come from?
I did a lot of research, a lot of journalism. That's not a story that I took, but I did, for example, research into the kinds of injuries that are caused, medical data, the kinds of injuries that are caused by these types of IEDs and what happens inside the body and what's left of the victims of that sort of thing. I obviously know we have a lot of male and female soldiers in the United States who have toddlers at home, and that was just the kind of scenario that could very easily happen. If I didn't I've never used an adult voice in a book like this before, and I realized that if the reader didn't hear the dad's voice and find out his story, that he would look like my dad looked like to me and my mom, which is just kind of a drunken bum who's being a real jerk because he's not taking care of his family. But if you go to the trouble to find out what they've been through, then, your heart just opens. You're like, oh my gosh. I mean, I was a kid during the Vietnam War, and I remember very clearly how poorly we treated returning soldiers from Vietnam. Many people, you know, those poor men, boys, were disrespected and spat upon, and you know, they were drafted. They weren't there because they wanted to be there. And I am proud of America that we've learned from that horror. We've learned that even if you disagree strongly with the war, that you don't hurt the people who signed up to fight it, that they need, and which is, we all say commonly in the United States, thank you for your service, which is a huge, wonderful step that we've taken. But I didn't flinch. Obviously that's a pretty intense passage. I didn't flinch from trying to testify to the realities of their situations, because I wanted, especially my younger readers, because they're going to be dealing with this for the next 40 years, to understand what our soldiers have been through and our responsibilities as a nation, not to just care for them, which we're not doing, but also to make resources available for the people who love them. We have somewhere between 20 and 22, I forget which statistic is accurate, living, 20 or 22 million living veterans in America right now. That's a lot of people, I mean, especially when you think about the number of children they have and the number of grandchildren they have. And I'm here to tell you my dad's trauma has absolutely touched my children. So that's 3 generations of my family in a very small, contained way were affected by my dad's service. And when you look at this current generation, because of the advances in medical care, we are bringing home soldiers who have survived injuries that they never would have survived in other wars. And so we don't know how to care for them properly, and we are refusing as a nation, or at least I should just say our government, is refusing to find the moral courage to pay for caring for them.
You know, when I was reading your book, I loved it on so many levels, and one of them was that I think it's just really important now.
Yeah.
And it seems like it would have been really easy for you to have mined your own experience and tried to write it from the World War II perspective. And Rita Sebatis, I think she wrote a blurb at the back of your book.
Yeah.
And she obviously was dealing with World War II. That's obviously a subject that continues to fascinate young kids even today. You could have chosen that. You could have chosen Vietnam. You chose Iraq and Afghanistan. Why did you want to set this story now? You write modern fiction.
Well, I do. I think because well, there's also another piece of this, and that is what we're talking about with PTSD is we're talking about behaviors that often look like addiction behaviors. And we have a lot of families in the United States who maybe didn't have to deal with the struggles of military service and the wounds that come out of that. But for other reasons, you have a parent or two who have other struggles, who are dealing with their prescription drug addiction, or they're drinking. And so if you, I wanted the book to be, yes, about this subject matter, but larger, to be about what do you do if you're a teenager and your parents are not present, either emotionally, intellectually, or physically. How do you learn how to grow up when you're the one who's having to be in charge? That's a situation that way too many of our kids are in. So that's why I wanted to set a term today.
Can we talk a little bit about inspiration? You said that Speak was inspired by a nightmare.
Yeah.
We were talking about this particular book having been inspired by a family, your own father and a nephew. Can you talk about it, where inspiration is struck for some of your many other novels?
Yeah, it comes, I mean, I need to live 300,000 years. Because there are so many stories out there that just we all need to become writers. Because this is how we make sense of our world, and this is how we make our world better, and it's how we connect with each other is when we tell stories. So let me just run through them real quickly. Catalyst, I wrote because there was an article that I read in the Philadelphia Inquirer that made me so angry. I threw the newspaper across the room and said a lot of really, really bad words loudly. The article was about a very gifted athlete. She was a young woman, captain of her basketball team. Just this kid had so much going for her. She was smart, honor society, and community service, and saving the world from hunger, and just a sweet girl. And you know, D1 schools were recruiting her. And this is the sentence that made me write an entire book. The reporter said, and she gets by on 4 hours of sleep a night. Like that was a good thing. And I was so enraged that sentence so encapsulates this attitude about what we expect from our teenagers and all these pressures we put them through, and at the time in their life when they most need 15 hours of sleep a night, if they're going to grow up to be healthy, you know, we're like, hey, you don't sleep at all, you're pretty awesome. I mean, what a great way to set up somebody for total psychiatric meltdown. So I wrote a book, Catalyst, is about a kid who looks perfect. It seems like and her mask has been on so long that her face has conformed to it. And then some things happen that crack open her heart, and she has to recalibrate. It was also, by the way, the main character loves science in that book, and chemistry in particular. And I did that because I kind of get pissed off when I see my friends writing main characters in their books who love writing and poetry. I think that's cheating. I think you should push yourself. And chemistry was the class I came closest to flunking. And I only passed by one grade. I got 66 in chemistry, and I'm pretty sure it's because my chemistry teacher didn't want to see me again the next year. So I thought, now that's a good challenge to write about somebody who's so different from me. They actually love chemistry and might go to MIT. And it turns out that if you learn chemistry when you're 40, it's much more interesting. Because I actually got the AP books, and I kind of taught myself enough chemistry to write the book. Winter Girls is about eating disorders. It's the closest I've come to writing a horror novel, because there's nothing, that's the worst addiction out there is eating disorders. They're awful. And I wrote that for two reasons. I had a friend who's a pediatrician who has a large adolescent practice and had been bugging me for years to write about a book about eating disorders that might help those young girls and young boys the way that Speak helps victims of assault. And I really rejected her idea because, you know, my generation, we all struggle with our body image, and I just didn't know if I could go there. And then within 1 week, I got 3 letters, old school letters, written to me from readers who loved my other books, who were all in inpatient eating disorder clinics. And I went, oh, I get it. I'm supposed to be writing about this. So Twisted I wrote because of the response I got to Speak. For a while there in my life, I was doing a bazillion school visits every year. And often I would speak to classes where Speak was discussed, and the young boys, I got the same question from boys all over the country, which was, they would like the book. It was better than a lot of the other books they had read that year. But they'd say, I didn't understand why she was so upset. I got that question from every demographic, from every kind of kid you could imagine. It was the best question I've ever heard in my life. And hats off to the young man who had the courage to ask it. And so I started to ask them questions. And they would explain to me that, well, it's not a stranger in the bushes with a gun, right? And they were just filling it in on what it looked like to them. And then I realized I knew nothing about teenage boys. My son was 9 at the time. And then so as I traveled around the country, I would sit down whenever I could to sit down and talk to teenage boys to find out what was hard in their life. And the 3 threads that came out of those conversations, number 1, they were all confused about girls. Number 2, they had all dealt with bullying, every single one of them at some point. Many of them told me they became bullies because they got tired of being picked on. And this is the worst one, number 3, is how many young men I ran into who were just deeply saddened in the most poignant way possible because they didn't have a dad in their life. Even if their biological father lived in their house with them, he had emotionally checked out of their life. And then there's other boys who just don't have any kind of man in their life who, I mean, it doesn't have to be biology, it could be an uncle, it could be whatever, just somebody, to show you how to be a man, you know, to explain the rules of human dignity. And boys were really hungry for that. So that's why I wrote Twisted. And I wrote Prom because I was engaged to my childhood sweetheart. And I was so ridiculously happy I couldn't write a book in which somebody almost dies.
I'm going to switch gears here about Speak.
Yeah.
Because you say, how many times a day do you get asked about